Welcome to another edition of BoozWA. It might sound French, but we're 100% Pacific Northwest. We talk wine, beer, and all things wet in Washington. Here's your hosts.
Thank you for joining us and welcome to BoozWA, a lighthearted and behind-the-scenes look at the craft beverage industry in and around Washington State with your host Grant Monrian, Amber Peters, and me, Eric Diggerman of GreatNorthwestWine.com. This week took us to Barnard Griffin Winery in Richland and the Dean of Washington Winemakers, Rob Griffin, and his winemaking daughter, Megan Hughes. Rob talks about his fascination with fermentation as a high school student, which led him to the famous winemaking school at the University of California, Davis, and work with perhaps the most famous winemaker of the 20th century, André Tchelistcheff. Rob is not only one of the top winemakers on the West Coast, but he's also been among my favorite folks to chat with since I began writing about wine in 1998. Helping to bring this podcast to you is the family at Barnard Griffin, so hang out with us for a spell.
Do you want to count down?
I think you're good to go, sir.
Yeah.
Damn, I was going to do it in French.
Okay, do it.
Oh, but it's not a joke anymore. I
The
told you
surprises
the punchline. Okay.
So we are here with the Dean of Washington Winemakers, and I will give my longtime friend and co-creator of all this, Andy Perdue. I think he might have been the one to coin the title of Dean of Washington Wines for you, Rob. So welcome to the very first video podcast that we're doing here. And because I always appreciated the opportunity to talk about history with you, Megan was quick to point out that even though Sauvignon Blanc is like the hot variety right now, that you actually prompted the change from the Fumé to Sauvignon Blanc. So talk about the migration of your connection with the reference of Fumé Blanc and to where you're at with Sauvignon Blanc now.
Well, when we started producing a wine out of Sauvignon Blanc and called it Fumé Blanc back in 1983, I chose that name, because I liked it. It kind of pointed more to a Loire style, the Blanc Fumé de Pouilly, dry, acidic, and we had it then in a bottle that it was actually smoke colored, so it was kind of a cool subliminal packaging thing. And I liked the tradition, and I come from far enough back in California industry, I can remember Sauvignon Blanc and what they called the Chateau style, where they would blend enough muscat in to bring the sugar up to about 1.5% to 2%.
Whoa!
And that's how Sauvignon Blanc was bottled in minute quantities, because everything was bottled in minute quantities in the late 60s, early 70s in California, in at least cork finish bottles. But it became a situation of being a one-horse category, and if you're not in a category, you're not there. So we kind of reluctantly had to turn our Fumé Blanc into Sauvignon Blanc. The wine was exactly the same. Nothing changed in our production. Just what changed was the bottle and the name on the label. And frankly, that's always been, in the last, ever since that late 60s time, there's been no fundamental difference between Fumé Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc. I once went to a 1.5-hour seminar in California discussing that very issue, and it was just hilarious because it was, it was like a Monty Python. Some people were very serious about this, and others were just, you could see them laughing. I have to tell the story. One very prominent wine writer who was in his 80s at the time stood up about 3/4 through this thing and said, "I'm very bored and I have to," I will say, go to the restroom. But anyway, he got up and walked out, and I started clapping under the table. But I wasn't part of that seminar. I was in a different panel later in the day.
There are some mavericks in the industry for sure. So what vintage did you make the change from Fumé Blanc to Sauvignon Blanc?
Oh, I would say it was probably somewhere around 2017.
Okay.
I'm guessing.
Okay.
It's been a few years ago.
Were you involved in that?
Yeah, it was like 2012.
Oh, well, okay, so earlier than 2017.
So you weren't involved then?
Yeah.
Yeah, Megan's been full-time since about 2010 or so.
Okay. All right. Just in time for the cool vintages to arrive.
You know, and that is such a gift to me because whenever I think of harvest, I always like go buy like giant coats and never need them. And also when you talk about these like vintages under your belt and how you have to see stuff to know it, and wine is obviously a lot of science. Rob is like one of the smartest people, like as far as a chemist and biology mind, but also you have to, the other half of it is that artistic, that calmness, that, planning and strategy mind. And that is not stuff you can learn in a classroom. And so to have one of the coolest vintages be one of my first was great because nothing's ever been like it. And so I have this sort of confidence of saying like, okay, well, I've seen it. I know what those wines are going to taste like afterwards. I know what to look for in the spring. And even winters. So it's on April 4th, it snowed. Well, last year on April 11th, it snowed. And so it's all those like notes, and having Rob seen 40 some harvests in Washington, you kind of have this natural, like, okay, well, whatever happens, we've probably seen it before.
I'm just curious where in California you grew up and how you got interested in wine, what your childhood was like.
I grew up in the, I think they call it the East Bay of California, a little town called Martinez. If you know the area, closer to a little town called Lafayette. But anyway, I grew up on a piece of property that my great-grandfather had purchased my great-great-grandfather had purchased in the 1860s. Apparently his wife was absolutely furious because he could have bought good Lodi river bottom land for 50 cents an acre. But instead he bought this scrabbly adobe hillside in a place called the Alhambra Valley. So anyway, that's where I grew up, with a strong sense of, place and history where I happened to come from. Interestingly enough, this little town of Martinez was the original location of a winery called the Christian Brothers, which used to be a very large part of the American wine scene. They're long gone now, but in any event, I had an uncle, my dad's elder brother, who retired at a youngish age and bought a prune orchard and wine grape vineyard on the Napa River on the Oakville Crossroad. This was back in the early 60s, before Napa Valley was Napa Valley. It wasn't Disneyland. It was just an area that happened to grow some grapes and made some wine. And in any event, I was very fortunate to be exposed to early days, but transitional days in that part of California. And I just got utterly fascinated by wine and the fermentation process and so on and so forth as a high school student. Kind of the clouds parted, a ray of light came down, and I started fermenting stuff. Your normal teenager doing that would be doing it for the alcohol, and I have to say that isn't what intrigued me. The process intrigued me. So I was fortunate to be admitted to study this stuff at the University of California at Davis, and went on to a degree, and came out of Davis at a time of recession in the industry. So I started my professional career for, I think it was $2.35 an hour with a shovel, walking through a vineyard in the very lowest end of Sonoma. And by low, I mean geographical. And in any event, shortly found myself transferred into the laboratory with a 5 cent an hour raise. Pretty exciting. And, anyway, a wonderful opportunity to get some hands-on, ground-up learning in the American wine industry. And this was with a company called Buena Vista, which is still with us under different ownership. And during that time, I was very fortunate to be, at least twice a month in about a 1-hour session with the great consulting enologist, André Tchelistcheff. I was pretty much a fly on the wall while André was telling myself, but more importantly, my immediate supervisor, what he thought we should be doing with the wines. And of course, if he thought we should be doing it, that's what we did. But that was a very helpful opening to the logistical side of winemaking. It's, it's one thing to know the chemistry, but knowing how to wire a pump at 2 in the morning is equally important.
There's not a lot of cigarette smoking in the wine industry these days, right? But André that was part of almost an affectation with him, right?
Absolutely. He had a cigarette lit almost every moment, and we had to open the windows in the laboratory and ventilate when we were there, because it was taught to me that if you're a smoker and have done it long enough, it doesn't really affect your ability to taste all that much, but it sure as hell messes up the people around you. So that was a different time and a different place. But André, without a lit cigarette, would not have been the right look.
Yeah, that's pretty fun. I see the photographs of him with the white lab coat, they're kind of iconic. So, Megan, do you remember your first day on the job pulling a paycheck here at Barnard Griffin?
Gosh, well, my first days were at home doing things that, a 4-year-old could do. But my first day here, I don't remember it. I think I always came back and worked part summers here, like on the bottling line. So I knew everyone.
And Megan started pretty much in the cellar, one of the crew, and she learned a lot about just the workaday part of emptying a barrel and washing it, and so on and so forth. We had always hoped she would find herself an intern at Chateau Lafite or something, but just like her dad, she came out of college at a time of worldwide recession, and there weren't any jobs.
We started off with the rosé. Can you talk about the genesis of the rosé program? Because that's at least nationally, that's really what you're known, and rightfully so, with all the awards you've won at the largest wine competition in the country.
Yeah, we started making rosé pretty much by accident, I guess, to be honest. And as I've told the story too many times. Our good friend Maury Balcom was the grower who helped us get into the industry way back in 1983 by loaning us a few grapes. Sure. Somewhere in the intervening years, Maury got the idea that he needed to plant some Sangiovese, a grape not widely planted in Washington at all. He showed up on my doorstep in the late 90s saying, Rob, what are we going to do with this Sangiovese? And my reaction was, we? But nonetheless, I, happily made the wine for him with the idea that we would do something with it if it wasn't part of our program, so be it. So we made red wine and found out, at least from his vineyard, that the color was a little weak, as frankly Sangiovese is anywhere. The acid was a little aggressive, as Sangiovese wants to be, and the lovely fruit qualities that came off during fermentation. They were gone. I said, what made, at best a mediocre red could make a dynamite rosé. So the next year, in almost an experimental basis, we made about 400 cases of a dry rosé of Sangiovese. And we convinced our then Seattle wholesaler that they needed to try and take it to market. And they were very concerned. Dry rosé really wasn't a thing. This was on the rump end of the white Zinfandel craze that some of your listeners will remember. But in any event, the wine was a knockout success. It sold out in a ridiculously short amount of time. And the next year we made quite a lot more, and so it went. And somewhere along there, we started entering it in the San Francisco Chronicle competition. Entering a competition is a great way to see just where you belong in the hierarchy. And in any event, we started out by getting gold medals and culminating in an actual honest-to-God best of show, a shared award. They had a best of show in white, in rosé, and in red. But all of that to one side, a competition with something like 5,000 entrants, most of them from California. We felt that we were doing something right. And then, of course, many years later and quite a bit of success, COVID comes along. And I would say that a disproportionate amount of this wine sold in restaurants, and of course restaurants were gone for a period of about 18 months, and a number of them have never come back. A number have come back very well, but we have been regaining territory in rosé, but it's been a big success for us.
So this has kind of been, I've gotten the sense that this has kind of been your project, the rosé, whereas Maggie, you're involved, kind of oversee all the other things. Is that fair assessment?
I like to think that we're all watching everything at one time. If you talked about what I, as an almost 70-year-old, doddering old one-time winemaker, do, it still has an enormous influence on things, is I get to call where the grapes are coming from and when we harvest them. We do this collegially, but at the end of the day, it's my call. And then once they get here, I'm heavily involved in initial processing, and then the whites get into Megan's territory, although we've all decided what protocols we're going to use. I'll occasionally even mess with her fermentation temperatures, but I try not to do that. And likewise in the reds, Mickey, our associate winemaker, has a huge amount of input in the production side there, the pump over regime, so on and so forth. But once again, all three of us are involved to one degree or another in everything.
How does it make you feel in your heart knowing that your daughters are involved in what you've created here?
Oh, it's wonderful. The idea that there may be some continuity in this business is very, very exciting to us. They will face lots of challenges and differences in the industry that we didn't. We got started at a time when there were relatively few Washington wineries.
It's something that I hadn't really given much thought to, but there's a lot of learning in the Washington wine industry that you were kind of on the ground floor of, and a lot of the protocols have already been established.
When I got here in 1977, there was one other educated winemaker in the industry, and we fortunately had Dr. Chaz Nagel at WSU, who had run a wine research program at a major California winery. He was definitely a top-ranking wine scientist, and he would answer phone calls if you were lucky enough to catch him. And that was your main resource. You could go to the library in Prosser, where they had some older editions of trade publications, which were frankly useless. When you got into a real technical problem, there wasn't a lot of resource to work with. Now, in today's world, the internet is alarmingly full of great information. And also there's, the one advantage of having 1,000 wineries in the state is there a corresponding number of winemakers, and it's a little easier to get some peer advice if you feel you need it. And that's a big change. But in the intervening 40 plus years, the vines have gotten older, the growers have gotten older, the winemakers have gotten older, and I think in many respects we've gotten smarter. If you think back to early days, your average Washington grape grower was somebody who happened to also be growing Concord grapes. That was an obvious intro to the idea of growing wine grapes. And Concord grapes as a crop have a couple requirements. One is a whole lot of water, and the other is a lot of fertilizer. Otherwise, you just leave them alone. Wine grapes are very, very different. They're prone to disease. Too much water is destructive from a number of different angles. Too much fertilizer is a horrible thing, and so it's a whole new learning curve. The same is true for winemaking styles. When I was a student, we were taught that red wine grapes are ripe at about 22.5% sugar, and you shouldn't really let them hang out much longer. And that made a style of wine that is a little more hard-nosed than what has become the standard now. So much of my career has been relearning what I was taught, as is true in anybody's career, I think.
So my glass is almost empty. Megan, I wanted to ask you kind of like the collegial approach in the wine. So you're part of a couple of groups, and just kind of the synergy and fellowship that happens in there. And then Rob, while she's doing that, can you pour the Côtes du Rob?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that the industry is still sort of striving to be this one unit, and Washington can do so many things so well, and that is rare. You know, we don't have one or two grapes that everybody gets to go push out into the national market and have this great story. It makes it a little bit challenging, but also it makes it really fun because you can grow anything really well here. And so I try to stay as on top of, you know, trends and what our neighbors, you know, and are doing in the industry. And then also, you know, a business standpoint too. It's not just one, you know, we are a winery, we are a tasting room, we are a hospitality industry, but we're also a business and a family owned manufacturer. And so I'm on the board for the Association of Washington Business, and really just looking to, you know, have growth for the business of Washington. And that's a cool opportunity as a second generation owner.
One of the things that is pretty apparent whenever somebody comes in from the outside into the Washington wine industry, whenever you go down seemingly almost anywhere, is a lot of sharing of knowledge, people building genuine friendships and relationships. Is that fairly uncommon outside of Washington?
I've never made wine anywhere else. My guess is yes, but I wouldn't know.
In my time in the late 70s in Sonoma County in California, there was a fair degree of camaraderie.
Okay.
There was a pretty active, regional winemakers group that got together and tasted and talked. But my understanding is in the intervening years, it's gotten a lot more competitive. People are a little more secretive. There's competition over certain grape sources. And you know, I think back to my very early days, it was kind of an all for one and one for all approach, because everything Washington related had to be missionary work. I mean, Washington was Washington. We didn't have the hyper local regionalism that we have now. You know, my side of the hill is the best side of the hill.
When did you start the Côtes du Rob?
Oh, we started this project, I think it was 2007, although I've been caught off guard remembering dates more than once. But we've been working primarily with the Lonesome Spring Ranch in just a little bit to the east of Benton, to the west of Benton City. And it's a field blend of Rhone varieties, and that's a very unique thing for us, a field blend. We're harvesting Grenache and Mourvedre and Syrah and Cinsault and Counoise, all of that in small quantities, all on one day. They're all going into the same pot, as it were, and we ferment them together, co-fermentation. So much of what happens in this wine is a direct reflection of what's happening in the vineyard.
Is this the closest you get to a GSM?
Yeah, it's kind of our version of a GSM. I don't think I had even heard that term when we started this. I call it Côte de Robe as a wink and a sneer at Côte de Rhone. It's my slightly off-center sense of humor. But if you take a look at the label, it's kind of an homage or a parody to traditional Southern Rhone wine labels.
Thank you so much for sharing all these wonderful wines you guys have put your heart and soul into and created. Also, your guys' labels are awesome. And I saw the one online that has a mammoth skull on it. And you have this wonderful playful Griffin label. I was just wondering, are you guys a big part of what the graphic design element?
We have a very talented person in-house who creates this stuff often from my poorly focused verbal descriptions of what I would like to see. She is actually able to do it. That's our hospitality director, Liz, who's a very important part of the organization. And we are lucky to have a lot of people on staff who've been with us a long time and have helped us grow. But almost anything you see with a label on it she and we had something to do with producing. But when it gets down to the art and making the cute idea real, the credit goes to Liz.
How do you recreate something so old into something new and forward to a new group of people? Like you're trying to...
I don't think you have to, which is the fun part. I think every year has its own character. I think every vineyard site has its own character. And I think the tradition of that and that evolution of agriculture is what keeps it fresh. Now, nobody will argue that we don't need younger drinkers, because we do. But I do think that history is increasingly interesting, especially when you get to a level of, your food journey or your drink journey where you're like, okay, I care about where this came from. Let me do some more research. And that path is going to lead a lot of people to family-owned wineries that know where their grapes are coming from, know the land, know who makes them.
And the food component.
And the food component. Yeah, the same way that you may care about where your meat comes from, you should also care about where your wine comes from for the very same reasons.
Do you have anything to weigh in on that, Rob?
I think that was pretty well said. That we as an industry wring our hands and clutch our pearls about how we're going to engage a younger generation. One thing that we do here is we have always tried to keep at least some of our wines approachable from an affordability standpoint. And, we have responded to opportunities to growth not by raising our prices, but by making more of a given variety and just spreading a little wider. So that's all part of the Washington missionary work I think we all need to do to continue to build and expand the region. And it's up to Megan to get the younger generation excited. I'm an old fart.